Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of season 2015, Taking Liberties. Today, there's myself, Vikas, and I have Austen and Lee joining me. So it's just a three-person show today. So compared to the five-person show we had last week, it's going to be a little bit quieter. But look, I personally think it's a quality over quantity thing. Not to take the piss out of our other panelists, but I think we've got better quality tonight.
We have
Whoa, whoa. Them's the fighting words.
Well, you were there last week, so. um,
Both of us were.
yes, but keeping in the theme of quality and cultural standards, a game called Hotline Miami 2 was recently refused classification by the OLFC, which is the Office of Film and Literature in Australia. Office of Film and Literature Classification. Now, they're the guys that put the M or the PG or the G or whatever rating you might have on basically anything that's on TV, anything that's at the movies, and games. Now, we recently allowed the R18 plus rating thing, which people suggested would end the massive censorship regime that was going on in Australia as a result of the refused classification. So if you're not aware about how bad this is, Australia has officially refused classification, that is, refused the sale of more books, more games, and more TV shows in this country than China. Yeah, that is a real statistic. I will link you to Wikipedia and you can check that shit out. Yeah, an Australian publisher literally is less capable of publishing something than a Chinese dissident. Let that sink in. So,
It's worth pointing out, probably point out like what the criteria under which most of these things have been refused. So most games that there's actually there's actually a website called refusedclassification.com, and essentially they list all the games and all the movies and all the rest of it's been banned. Most of the games that have been knocked back have pretty much been either drug related or violence related. I mean, not too many games actually have that much sexual content for whatever reason. There are some games that have been banned for sexual content reasons, but mostly it's because it would seem drug use is actually the main one now. So the main change between the previous, having just MA and now R is essentially it seems to be more violence. So games can be more violent. You got games like Mortal Kombat, which have been allowed, were refused classification previously. Were allowed to be released as R18. It's just a very violent
Well,
game.
everybody knows that the moment a kid sees a video game character tearing the spine out of another video game character, it's only a matter of time before he does that to his best friend. And then there's spines everywhere.
Yeah, I always try to take my hats and decapitate people with them. But so it's I think it's worth pointing out that it's primarily about drugs, just how petty it is. Like you can't even. So a great example was Fallout 3. So Fallout 3 had morphine, it had heroin, it had a bunch of like actual real life drugs that you could consume for positive benefit, and it was refused classification on that basis. And then they went back and changed the names to like MedX or like a bunch of other like fake names. Didn't change anything about it, and it was allowed sale. So I guess part of the issue is how ridiculously 17th century the attitude of the classification board is, because there's stuff like
promoting designer drugs over well-known label drugs.
Yeah.
You can't use drugs if they're well-known to the public, but as long as they come up with a new cool name, go for it.
I mean, the thing that came to my mind is, okay, so Pulp Fiction, right? So the Hotline Miami was refused because of it's actually got an implied rape scene in it, and it's got drug use. Well, okay, Pulp Fiction has a rape scene where a black man is tied up, gagged, raped by two male white supremacists. It's depicted on screen. It has drug use. It's got pretty full-on violence. It's got heaps of swearing, and yet it's a classic of like 90s cinema. And people don't even worry about it. And it was certainly allowed within Australia under R18. And yet now we have this game where the game Hotline Miami itself, if you don't know familiar with the game, the character might be depicted. I think it's depicted taking drugs and this rape scene in a cutscene. So it's not even you're actively participating. It's just you observe it happening, and then you go away. And the actual gameplay itself is just violence. So I guess part of it is, I mean, and we'll get into whether we should have a classification board at all, but it's
game.
That's it. Yeah, it's a 2D sprite game. Like it's not, it's not a drug simulator. It's not a rape simulator. It's a violent game that has this other stuff, which in other medium would be completely permittable.
Well, how long is it before the nanny state comes down on games like Candy Crush as well for promoting abusive use of sugar and other unhealthy things? I mean, that's far more of a problem in Australian culture than drug use and post-apocalyptic wasteland morphine use.
Well, actually, and this is why I personally this is nothing new amongst gamers, right? People who play games all say the OLFC shouldn't exist. However, we kind of tempered our opinion and sort of because people from the Sex Party and people from Electronic Frontiers Australia were saying oh no, you don't need to get rid of it because that's hard to do, that's hard to convince people of, right? Instead, we just bring in the R18 classification, and once the R18 classification comes in, they'll stop being such censor heavy. They'll stop trying to determine Australian culture in such a way that we literally have to pirate stuff to get these fairly mainstream games into the country, and it's turned out that hasn't worked. And I just want to say, when is the point where now we can start a public campaign to say, hey, look, the OLFC, they are actually just a bunch of fascist censors, right? That is what they are, right? That is literally what they are. And it's not just that. I just want to say, you can't even make the argument that most left-wingers say that, hey, there's been a case of market failure here, right? That they're feeling the need to determine what's safe for consumption, because there are other boards that already do this that are internationally accepted. ESRB, PEGI, right? They're the two major big ones. That one's European, one's American, right? And you're telling me, right, that every other country in the world has it wrong and that Australia has it right, and that Australia is banning far more content than any other country put together. Right, that to me says that there is something wrong with our regulator, and not with the products that are coming through.
Yeah, I mean it is an anachronism. I don't know to what extent you might convince. So I mean, to think about games. So the reason why games are different is because they're new. So if you go back to the 1700s and you talk about the novel, the novel was going to corrupt all the youth and this and that and the other. It's always been that the latest form of media has been the target of lots of censorship.
Would you say it was the most novel form of media?
You could say that indeed. It's you could say even that these censors are spineless. But the thing is, I think most the R18, the thing we need to essentially have happen is have all the old people die. The reality is, the average gamer is actually 35. Gaming
that
is
far more controversial than anything I said. And all I was saying is removing our removing our 1945's antiquated censor regime.
I'm not saying kill the old people. I'm saying wait for them all to die. So essentially, there's still the perception amongst the baby boomers, amongst all the policymakers, that games are for kids. Well, they're not. The average age of the gamer is 35. Gaming is much more diverse than some nerd at his computer, which more diverse than us right now. You got mobile gaming, you've got PC gaming, you've got console. It's really diverse, and essentially you just need to wait for those people, our generation, to actually move, get to the stage where we are politicians, that they are the standard, the people making the policies, and then it will be less, gaming won't be just seen as a kid's thing. Now, I mean, I'd love to see, I hate censorship, and I'd like to see it go, but I just don't know that you're going to get the political support to abolish something that's, and probably has some role in censoring maybe legitimately stuff that stuff should be refused classification. You think about, bestiality and all the rest of it. That stuff gets refused classification as well. So
I'm saying that there's no case of market failure whatsoever. There are already standard sports, right? They already exist. And not just that, not only do they already exist, they're more accepted than the OLFC, right? There are more people that accept PEGI ratings than our fucking... Sorry, pardon my French. There are more people that accept the PEGI rating system around the world, right? Because that is actually the most popular one, than than our OLFC rating. And it's
Well,
just the only...
I just want to throw in something here. I was a little curious. So I did a little Google search for Heroin Hero, and within 30 seconds, I was playing a game that literally is yourself injecting heroin in your arm, chasing a dragon around. That exists, and there are absolutely no filters on obtaining that game. And so it's just sort of ludicrous that we are protecting our youth by stopping them from going and buying these $70 video games, because little kids don't have $70, and at least they didn't in my day. Actually, it's absolutely like a symbolic censorship as well. It's not functional.
I was gonna say, it's actually a symbolic censorship that we have. It's not the case that you can't get these games. It's just the case that Australian publishers can't make any money off it, which to me just smacks of crazy, right? I'm just like, that's a lot of money that the government is potentially missing out through taxation, and it's like a symbolic, hey, fuck you guys, we don't want this in our country. But you know what? Just get a pirate, just get it illegally, and you're good.
Yeah.
It just
that's
seems like,
and the publisher, the creators of the game, turned around this week and said, "We're not going to, because you can appeal your decision." And they said, "We're not going to appeal. Australians should just pirate our game." That's literally the own pirate our game. And in the case of like where you had in the world where you actually had to physically go buy a copy of a game in a store, censorship kind of worked to an extent. But in the case of Hotline Miami, it's primarily offered on Steam, which is an online distribution platform. And as so you can just completely circumvent it. And actually, I should point out that Chris Berg, when he's in his book on free speech, he actually talks about this element of how censorship, how technology overcomes censorship. So if you really want to read about the historical examples of how censorship didn't work and how technology circumvented censorship, you should really check it out. I really recommend it.
Okay, but see, this also comes to my next point, right? This actual censorship regime is part of one of many things that add to stuff that we gamers collectively call the Australia tax on games, right? Yeah. Like now, if I want to buy that game, if I want to buy Hotline Miami legally, right, what I have to do is I have to open up my VPN and I have to connect to a store in some other country. I have to pay the Forex conversion rate to get that onto my account now, which, it adds a bit of a cost. And the thing is, if you want to think about it, you even have to do very similar things to acquire legal products to get that here. But that's a different story entirely. That's got to do with parallel imports and other weird shit.
Well, I mean, quite frankly, the notion of having different markets for digital goods is ludicrous on its own. The notion of having different, selling a different version of a game in a different country, selling a different zone Blu-ray in a different country is incredibly outdated and archaic.
The Blu-ray zones are actually gone now.
Well, I know, but that's the thing. It's they're pointless. This whole idea that technology is not a global market is ludicrous, I think.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, we're probably running out of time to talk about this issue, but I mean, that really gets into what private distributors want to sell in their different markets. So, I mean, that's why, songs cost a different price on iTunes, and games cost substantially different on the Australian Steam store as opposed to overseas things. So, yeah, that's a whole different topic, though. That's the reason why we have different digital markets is because the publishers of these things want them in different markets. Some of that might be tied to copyright and how that's exploited by special interests in the US and all the rest of it. But yeah, I don't know if that's quite necessary because of the government. Yeah, it's not quite the same. No. We should probably move on because we're running out of time. We've been on for about 15 minutes already.
So, potatoes. That's a pretty smooth segue, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, talking about later.
There is
while we're still on antiquated government regulatory bodies.
Yes, that's a great segue. That's a good one.
Let's talk about the Potato Marketing Corporation. I believe that's what they're called, isn't it? Because PMC stands for because to me that the PMC has always meant because to me PMC has always meant private military contractor. So so Potato Marketing Corporation. So that's weird. You being a West Australian must find a Soviet era regulator confusing.
So it's funny. It's actually so essentially the the reason this all came up is there's a guy called Tony Galati, right? He's a potato farmer in Western Australia, and he's regularly got himself into trouble, literally been fined tens of thousands of dollars by the government because he keeps going up against this potato marketing corporation, which is Soviet-era socialist kind of price. You got price controls, you've got like quotas, you've like growing quotas. I mean, when was the last time you heard about growing quotas? Then there was in the last, when I've looked into it this week, you've got stuff like, they can search and seize your car. I found out that if you're 50, so it's to seize stuff from your car, not your actual car. Sorry, but they can search your property, search your car. You can't actually go around Western Australia with 50 kilos of potatoes without having paperwork testifying to the source of the potatoes. Like the regulation involved in all this is actually quite much more invasive than you'd actually think. Like it's much more than price controls, which is kind of weird. It's like this little twilight zone. But it is probably the last bastion of like out and out complete protectionism in probably maybe anywhere in Australia. Actually, maybe not anywhere. Certainly in Western Australia, it's probably the most egregious source. And essentially, it's making potatoes more expensive for everybody. And it benefits. There's about 80 farmers. There's 80 farmers that benefit from it. So it's a perfect example of like public choice of where literally, less than 100 families are benefiting from consumers, the expensive consumers. It's a shocker.
So the thing I found interesting about this is, so firstly, the Liberal Party, our right-wing corporate party, for some reason supports this, and also the other part was that the PMC seems to be pushing out that West Australians pay the least for potatoes across the entire country. Now, I find that standard to be interesting because you can subsidise the cost of something to make it the cheapest in the country. And I, as someone who lives in the ACT, whose electricity is subsidised by all of you, I can attest that I do have the cheap. Yes. I can attest that I do, in fact, have the lowest cost electricity in the entire country, and that is largely due to the subsidisation of the Australian taxpayer across the entire country. So thank you once again. I'm really just rubbing this in right now. But but
you have to live in Canberra for that. So trade-offs.
Trade-offs, yeah. So that's a good point. That's a good point. I have to live around the swill. But I digress. So I found that to be a rather strange standard to use, because what I would be more interested in is what is the rate of pricing change in of potatoes in West Australia? Like, is it something that's monotonically increasing, as what you would see with something that is generally very price regulated, or is it stable, which is what you see out of something that experiences a lot of swap trading, or is it like all over the place and fluctuating, which is what you'd see in the free market?
To be honest, I think the real question is not are prices low, because that the assumption baked into that is that you've got this ideal price of potatoes, and at which you don't want to be selling potatoes for any less than that. And I think if you ask any Australian consumer, would you rather pay less for this bag of potatoes than you're paying now? None of them are going to say it. Literally none of them are going to say, oh no, we've already got the lowest potato prices in the country.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to pay any less for these potatoes. That would be tragic. Right? It just doesn't make sense.
So just to add to that.
Sorry, I was just going to say, like I actually live in an electorate which has potato farmers. So basically, there's a particular part of Western Australia where all the potatoes are grown. My local member of parliament, I'm part of the Liberal Party. My local member, she ran for pre-selection quite recently for a by-election, and really, I mean, the guy in the branch that I'm in, who delivers the most amount of people to any event. If you held an event, this guy would bring 50 people, guaranteed. They'll all come with their wallets. He is a potato farmer, and so even if she wasn't a protectionist, which I think she is, but even if she wasn't, if you wanted to run in this kind of area as a Liberal, you really want the support of the potato farmers. Like, they deliver genuine, tangible political benefits for their support. So, I mean, I think it's one of those things that, I forgot where I was going to go with this, but like, that's right. She brought up, we have the cheapest prices, but I said, well, they could always be cheaper. Like, that's the thing. Like, I just wanted to. That's right. Second, what Austen was saying. Like, I just completely confused myself in that whole thing. But yeah, it's everybody. You know, it can be if it's cheaper. If it's cheap, it can always be cheaper. People always want cheaper goods, and any dollar that is spent on potatoes more than what it could be is a dollar wasted, because there's a dollar that could be spent on education. It could be spent on, you know, a whole range of things that people would want to spend on to better their lives.
Well, and this is the classic thing that Bastiat writes about time and time again in his work about what is seen and what is not seen, is that it's very easy to see that potato farmers are benefiting from having price controls, but what's not seen is all the money that could be spent on other things that is instead being funneled into this horrible mash of potatoes, and that it really could be spent on other things. It's just, I mean, the chips are down and my brain is fried and I'm out of potato puns.
You're really deep frying this, aren't you? I mean, it's very it's like for consumers, because we sort of think, well, okay, consumers, their lives are worse off because they can't spend more money on other things. But it's also the impact it has on the distorting of the labor and capital. So you've got all these potato farmers, and people are pouring their lives into this. It's much the same with the car industry. You know, they pour their lives into this particular industry that has no future. For maybe in the case of the car industry, there was no future. In the case of the potato industry, you know, individual families are basically sending their kids off to uni or you know, having their kids on the farm to train them up to continue this business that only exists because of a government, you know, a government special, you know, thing. Like it's, and if creative destruction was able to happen, you know, it's really Schubertian creative destruction would happen. Those people would go off and do something else. That land could be bought by other farmers. Those capital, you know, the capital that's invested in that could be used in other ways. And so it's not even just the consumers that miss out, but it's also the farmers that miss out, because they essentially trapped into this scheme that is a dead end.
I'm going to disagree with you on one minor point, that because of the way the pricing structure is worked, we actually would probably see more potatoes being grown once we got rid of the price controls, not less. You wouldn't see potato land being converted into other land. If anything, you'd be seeing land that is being used suboptimally currently being used to grow potatoes.
No, I agree. No, you have less farmers with bigger farms. I mean, that's what really, in any business, if you want to improve your efficiency, you get bigger. So you, instead of having lots of little shops, you have a supermarket, which is literally just a big market. And that puts a bunch of small businesses out, but now you've got, you know, one big shop that deals with it all. And that'd be the same with potato farming. Like, instead of having lots of, you know, 80 families, you might have 40 families, but their farms are twice as big, their potatoes are half the cost, and they're putting out 4 times as much potatoes or something crazy, you know. And actually that's what we've seen in the dairy industry. So what the potato farmers bring up and what they fear is we deregulated the dairy industry about, I think it started about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And lots of families went out of business. There was lots of farmers that went out, but after that adjustment, that market adjustment, that's the thing, is the changing, the actual reality sunk in, and once you take away those government subsidies, you know, the market can adjust. You've actually seen a big increase in production. So it's actually hampering farmers as well as hampering consumers.
Well, I was going to say, the interesting thing about milk, and actually milk should be used as the story in this, and should be used as a rebuttal for whoever's telling you that this potato market thing is a good, potato marketing corporation is a good thing. You pay the same price now for a liter of milk than you did back in 1990. Now, that to me is 20 years of inflation that's occurred, right?
Yeah.
And you're still buying, and you're still paying the same price for milk. So, in effect, that's your productivity gain. Yeah. And it's tangible and measurable.
I think that one of the really important things to push from a libertarian free market perspective is that lower prices are a good outcome. They are a positive outcome, especially if that lower price is due to an increase in productivity. I think that's really something that we want to push, that we don't want to be spending, and people are used to prices going up because of inflation. And so when they see prices going down, it feels unnatural. But really, that ought to be the way that a well-developed, well-growing economy goes, is that the price of goods decreases.
And I guess that kind of taps into where the real politic is, because, farmers, I know through my stuff in the Liberal Party, I do know farmers that are genuinely free marketized, but I've also met lots of agricultural socialists, and there's heaps of them all over the country. And I guess this is kind of where
agri-socialists.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of romanticism in Australia and probably elsewhere in the West about farming and family farming. It's valued, it's seen as something worthwhile, and that's kind of where the socialists get their hooks in and turn that into rent-seeking opportunities. As they say, well, look at what happened to all these families going out of business. We don't want that to happen. So you should continue to support this thing. A bit like you said, the seen and unseen, and they say, oh well, milk is now cheaper than water, and they turn that into a negative. So I guess that's kind of where part of our argument has to be. It's not only just the economic argument of saying, well, this is actually better empirically for everybody, but you also have to really figure out how to make that into a palatable political message, because real change happens with politicians, and politicians don't work along rationality.
I'm mind blown by this. How is that not a palatable thing? Like, it's just like, okay, my income has grown by X, but I'm still paying the same amount as I did so many years ago for the same product. To me, that's just fantastic. I'm just like, I wish more things were like that.
Well, I think people have a tendency to see commodities. People have a tendency to see commodities fundamentally differently than they see other goods like technology. Like, if you spent the same amount on an iPod today that you did 20 years ago and got the same iPod you did 20 years ago, you would be absolutely appalled. You'd be like, well, this is crap. But if you spend that on milk, people are like, this is unnatural. How am I spending the same on the same product? That people expect improvements in some areas because that seems to have been what they've been observing, and they expect things to get more expensive in other areas. Again, because there's this sort of baked-in assumption that inflation is going to happen.
And I mean, it's also like it is I'm not saying for me it's palatable that this economic reality is true, but I don't know if that's an easier, like, that's not an instant sell for everybody else. Like, most of politics revolves not along empirical arguments. Like, it's not people pull out their stats, the facts, and say the statistics and say, well, this is better than this. It's a lot more about emotive language, and farmers have this emotional. This reserve of a sort of emotionally based political capital, or like political argument. They basically, people value the family farm, and so they tap into that by saying, well, we need to continue this rent seeking essentially because small farms are good, family farms are good, we like family farms, and so it kind of has to be something more than just, well, here's the cold hard facts, because they can't argue those. They'll argue the emotional side of things, and that's where I think libertarians have to be attuned to crafting a message that is as emotionally appealing as it is, factually appealing, if that makes sense.
I'll agree with that. But I think this might be an East-West divide, because I don't tend to hear the family farm argument so much here. And I suspect that's because we've already sort of made the connection that these rent-seeking behaviors typically affect the big end of town. They don't so much help the small end of town. It might be an argument that's popular in West Australia, and I've heard it used sometimes in what we colourfully call cattle country. Yeah. But
I mean, he's the perfect example of an agro-socialist. He's like the number one.
But it's not really that prevalent, I think, in South Queensland and like most of the southern states. I don't think it's really that well known. The typical reason that I hear...
Vikas, when was the last time you were west of the Blue Mountains? Or in a farmland area, and you talked to someone about their opinions on agricultural subsidies and drought relief? I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying it may be that your social group is not exactly the same social group that would be pushing for these sorts of programs.
I wholly concede that. And by the way, right now I am west of the Blue Mountains. So, so getting back to the point. The typical argument that's used here is, well, if we lose all the farms, we can't get them back again.
Yeah.
So there's like this thing that because of the lead-in time to grow a crop, and this assumption that everybody out there is basically out to screw us that isn't an Australian farmer. I don't know why. Because allegedly we're not paying them.
Because rent-seeking, that's why.
Yeah. But like anyway, so the assumption is anyone who's not an Australian farmer won't guarantee a food supply here. Therefore, we need to support the farmers because food security. That tends to be the typical argument that I tend to hear around here. But horses for courses, they're all the same.
I mean, it's really tied into. I mean, you look at someone like Barnaby Joyce, like he's an influential guy in that party. It's all got to do with like geographical, party politics. And I think that's, like maybe the Western Australian Liberal Party, most of the MPs couldn't give a rat's butt about potatoes, but there's a bunch of country MPs who are going to kick up a big stink, who actually will, this is something they have to face their constituents about. And so that's kind of where this comes in. And, I mean, I don't know, there's no easy fix. It's essentially, how do you defeat Renzi? Like, it's just an example. And I guess you just gotta. I mean, I know in my case, I'm actually going to make this an issue in my branch. I'll probably get crucified for it, but so be it. It's. But I guess you just got to try and win the argument against Renzi, whatever it is.
Well, I really hope that you can hash this issue out.
Yeah.
That was my last potato punch.
That was your last potato, yeah. Well, you know what? That's a battle that's going to be raging for a long, long time.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, you know what's not going to be raging for forever and ever? This very episode.
This show will rage forever.
This show will run forever, but unfortunately, this episode has to draw to an end. So I suppose that's our show for this week. Hope everybody had a great time listening. Thank you to Austen and Lee for joining me, and see everyone next week. Bye.
Bye.